Hello, this is the voice of Stewart Pearce, and welcome to my series of deep dialogues. These are vital conversations I engage in with global soul stewards from all over the planet, providing us with vital understandings about how we can create a new hierarchy of values to help us evolve into a brave new world. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening.
Hello here. This is such a treat, everybody, because we have the wonderful Barbara CLOW here, which is just so extraordinary. CLOW, rather. I beg your pardon, CLOW. Keep remembering cloud, Stuart. And it's such a treat because this extraordinary lady, well, I won't go on personally, but I will just share with you her amazing bio. And then, of course, you'll feel the exquisite vibration of Barbara as she emits through this wonderful transmission. Extraordinary information. So, of course, it's an official welcome to Barbara, but also to you all tuning in. This is a pre-record. And so you will be listening to this through your own time zones. And you are most welcome. So I say to you all, and I'm sure Barbara agrees with me, namaste, namaste. So who is this wonderful lady? Barbara is an internationally acclaimed writer of at least 50 non-fiction books, such as the Pleiadian Agenda, Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, Awakening of the Planetary Mind, and Astrology, the Awakening of Kundalini. And she was the acquisitions editor of Bear and Company, a great publisher from 1983 to the year 2000, whilst writing about and teaching at sacred sites around the world as a ceremonial teacher. In 2011, Barbara used astrology as her template and wrote prophetically about the global breakdown that would occur in early 2020. Which of course we're now all through. The first novel of this trilogy was called Revelations of the Ruby Crystal, the second, Revelations of the Aquarian Age, and the third, Revelations from the Source. Now, these extraordinary books explore the world breakdown from the end of the Mayan calendar in 2012 to the ominous conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in January 2020. And of course, now here we are in 2023. And so I'm really intrigued to find what Barbara has to say about the prophetic nature of these three extraordinary books, of where she feels the temperature of our consciousness is at this time. So Barbara, a huge welcome to you. It's so exciting to have you here. You know, you've been one of the reasons why the document and the theses of your work is so remarkable for me personally is because of its immense clarity. And I feel that this clarity, at least, I say I know, I feel, and therefore know, that one of the reasons why this clarity is so precise is because you're one of the few embodied witnesses of this extraordinary shift of consciousness that we're moving through, and that all of your wonderful emission, all of your expression comes right from your heart.
It's true. It does, indeed.
And of course, Barbara's work is much documented, everybody. So we'll share her website with you in a moment. And there are many references to all the interviews that she's given over the year. So we have a very remarkable soul steward with us. So Barbara, how has the trilogy lived itself through the point of prophetic detailing that first gave you the inspiration to write?
Yeah. Well, I always wanted to write fiction and not nonfiction. But knowing as much as I do about publishing, because I've also been in publishing, I knew that I would not be able to publish a novel successfully because it's just very difficult. Everything is aimed at basically sex and violence and not the kind of writing that I do. And I'm kind of basically like a 19th century English literature writer, really, where I'm combining context and data, daily data, with fictional, in a fictional system. And for me, what makes fiction great is the quality of the characters. And so what I always wanted to do was to write fiction with these inner characters that I've always felt. So I came to the point in 2011 where I was 70 years old, or a little bit older. I can't remember. I just turned 80 on Valentine's Day this year. So I think I must have been turning 70. And I decided it's time for me to do what I want to do. And I decided that no matter what the consequences were, and as soon as I made that decision, all of the characters that are in this trilogy, except one, appeared in my office. They weren't physical, but their sense of their personality, and there was a little bit of light connected with them. They were very present in my office, and they gave me their names, their background, and what kind of careers they were living with, and where they were living. They gave me a full data sheet on who they were, and it took 3 hours to write it all down on a yellow legal tablet. And it turns out, I found out later, that that's how Trollope used to always get his characters, which I thought was interesting because I've always loved Anthony Trollope. He's one of my favorite writers. So I went into the kitchen and told my husband, Jerry, who I teach with, I told him about these people because they were really, they're intellectual, they're esoteric, they're into astrology, they're into multidimensionality, they're into politics. These are really, really very advanced characters. One of them is even a magus, basically. Mm-hmm. So my husband just said, you have to write this. You have to do this. And this was amazing to me because whenever a new book came in, books have always just come in. The title and the material just comes in. And I would then go tell Jerry, well, I'm going to write a book about Chiron. And Jerry would go, Chiron? or how about Kundalini? Jerry always said, oh my God, what are you going to do next? But this time he encouraged me. And I'm bringing this up because this turned out to be critical, because this has ended up being the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, writing this trilogy. And I'm sure I couldn't have done it without encouragement. In fact, this trilogy, to tell you the truth, Stewart, has thrown me into a dark night of the soul, which is where I am right now. Like last night in the middle of the night, I tried to think about what I would talk about with you. And of course, I trust you. You'll know what to talk about. But I'm in such a dark night of the soul right now, that I don't almost know what to say about almost anything. But at the same time, as an astrologer, because I also am an astrologer, I know that we're very close to a shift now. We're very much down into a deep tunnel of darkness because we have been forced to face up to the truth about what's really going on around us. And until we recognize what politicians and bankers and public health people, et cetera, are actually doing, we can't figure out how to go to the next level because we're completely disarmed by not understanding what they're doing. So I understand why I'm at the dark night of the soul, and I understand why it's necessary. But it's almost hard to say anything when I'm sure you've been in this state yourself. And tomorrow, Saturn goes into Pisces. In a few weeks, Pluto goes into Aquarius. And we are on the edge of a huge shift. So perhaps you can dig something out of me that's wanting to come forward. I'll just say one more thing. What put me into the dark night of the soul is a simple thing. Back in 2011, I looked at the transits that would be occurring, as you said yourself, in 2020, 21, 22, basically 22. And I could see that our world was going to crack. Now, astrologers, really good astrologers, can see the kinds of energies that are going to be existing at a particular point in time, but it's not smart to predict what's going to happen. Once it happens, then you can understand the energetics of what's actually going on. So lo and behold, I predicted what was coming. then I wrote these 3 books. The first one came out, Ruby Crystal came out in 2015, or no, excuse me, 2012. And then Revelations of the Aquarian Age came out in 2015. And then Source, Revelations from the Source, just came out in just this last year. And so I wrote it all down, and then, my God, it actually happened. And what that threw me into was an intense journey that probably will result in another book, I don't know, into how can this be? Are we so fated by the planetary positions and transits that we are actually just basically, are we controlled by something? So then that threw me into the Gnostics and the issue of the archontic forces. It threw me into that whole data bank of the great forces that mold our reality. And it's been a very, very tough time for me. But at the same time, I think we're on the verge of using those forces in a more enlightened way.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So you're really articulating the immense shift that is personally happening within yourself as you relate to the long dark night of the soul, which I'm sure all of our listeners are familiar with, because the majority are spiritual initiates, some of many standing. Excuse me. And we know that that process may be invigoratingly painful, but at the same time, if we can keep seeing from a visionary faith point of view the light beyond as we go through the long dark night, the lantern always draws us towards a point of completion, and something very remarkable takes place within the totality of our consciousness. And so, you know, as I feel you deep within my own heart and within the embodied nature of the way that I live my life as a soulful being, I feel that you're literally holding a vital key. And the key is to do with this great shift away from the data control of pure intellect into a much more refined feeling state, so that we recognize that the divine and the sacred within the totality of the galaxy and our planet and our bodies is saying something very remarkable to us, so that we can shift into really understanding that feeling is the language of the soul, rather than this perpetuation of the cerebral nature of our beings. That doesn't mean to say, that you quite rightly have expressed, the nature of thought and the clarity of thought can be used as a beautiful compass. If we're not acknowledging the intuitive nature of our being, then we're not really seeing the transcendental corridors of light that bring us to a point of wonder and awe, which of course are difficult to feel when we're going through the incandescence of the long dark night of the soul. But if I may, I just to tease through this point of juncture that you're at, that we're all at, and being the remarkable custodian that you are, the curator of our souls, you are bound to feel it quickening within you in an extraordinary way. As you know, many thought projections coming in your direction, largely in consideration of, Barbara, help.
Yeah. And I could actually be specific about what I think that help needs to be.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you know, you don't know what it's like to lose a child unless you've lost a child. And this is one of those things that I can express now because of the pain that I've been living with. And I've been on vigil as we have allowed ourselves to start to see the real truth about what some people are doing on this planet. I've been holding a relationship with each one of those people who are doing whatever they're doing. And I've been letting them know, I see you and I know what you're doing. And I think it's important for all of us now to start to realize that we're all creating this. It's not just the bad people and the good people, you know, but we've got to be with the people who are actually going to have a revelation themselves about what they're doing. And I'm seeing many, many signs, you know, with the people that I consider to be planetary power monitors. I'm seeing many signs that they're changing. In fact, they seem to be getting out of sight as much as they can. And I don't really think it's because they think anybody can do anything to them. I just think that they're in a deep revelation of facing the results of their own actions. And so where that led me, being me, of course, is I went right straight for astrology, of course.
Yeah.
And that's when I could see that starting tomorrow, I mean, it's amazing when you and I had no control over when I would be here. And I don't choose shows based on astrology ever. But tomorrow is when the shift begins. And once it starts, it's going to be really fast, and there's going to be really a huge amount of very rapid change, because this is, you could say, since I'm a woman and I've given birth to 4 children, this is that point when the baby is really ready to come down to birth control. That's the canal. That's exactly where we are right now. And it's earth-shaking. And the reason I can see that is looking at the transits up through 2027. The heavens are going into a harmonic pattern now, almost like the last quartet, the last string quartet, say by Beethoven or something. The heavens are moving into a harmonic pattern. And when that happens, everyone will change. Yeah.
So there we have the hope. Before we move on, because I'd love to tease through something that just a short sentence that you wrote in your astrological forecast for the beginning of this year, where you annotate what you're revealing. Perhaps just for those people that maybe are not necessarily fully aware of the complexion of the astrological perspective that you're speaking of, that March the 7th is a powerful full moon, we're recording this on March the 6th. So March the 7th is a powerful full moon in Virgo, and the deliverance that you were speaking about. Could you just identify for us again what you're referring to in terms of this shift of consciousness from an astrological perspective?
Well, first of all, tomorrow, March 7th, Saturn comes out of Aquarius and goes into Pisces. And Saturn has been in Aquarius for 2.5 years. During this, I consider the last 2.5 years to be kind of the low point, the worst of it, since basically 2020. And so Saturn just is uncomfortable in Aquarius, because Aquarius wants to be free, wants to move, and wants to change and transform. And Saturn wants to hold structure and form very, very hard in place. And so when Saturn goes into Pisces, suddenly all that structure and control that has been plaguing us so much passes away, and we go into an experience with the spiritual realms. We go into contact with the etheric and with the spiritual realm. So that's one major change. And then on March 23rd, right after the spring equinox, Pluto goes into Aquarius. Now, Pluto rules the deep, it rules the darkest searching that we do within and within the earth itself. And Pluto is very revelatory, because Pluto just keeps pressing for the truth until it finally comes. And that's been an element all the way through this experience in general. But when Pluto goes into Aquarius, what's going to happen is everything is going to start to fly. And we've had such tension holding us through the 2020, 21, 22, that when it starts to fly, it's going to be like a flock of birds that just takes off. You know how that is. And Pluto in Aquarius, so the first thing astrologers do is they go back to, well, when was Pluto in Aquarius before? 1777 to 1796, when we had the Americans, just at the time of the formation of the United States and the French Revolution. And so I went back a couple of thousand years to look at every historical period when Pluto was in Aquarius. And what always happened, like one of the periods, for example, was the Renaissance. And so what always has happened with Pluto in Aquarius is very rapid societal change, very creative, very crazy, very, very wild. But the thing to also record, Stewart, is that a planet changes its influence on us when we actually see it from the Earth. So until 1930, nobody knew Pluto was up there. And isn't it interesting that I can go back thousands of years and look at every time Pluto was in Aquarius and I can see what was going on? But what happens when the planet is sighted by human beings, human beings integrate and embody the power of that planet. So this Pluto in Aquarius is going to be a revelatory and revolutionary experience, and people are going to be conscious of their role in it and their part in it, and they're going to find themselves almost like deciding, I haven't ridden a horse. I used to have a horse. I haven't ridden a horse for 20 years. I'm just going to go get on a horse and I'm going to go, right? Do you remember what it was like around the time of harmonic convergence? I know you do because you mentioned that painting it is connected to harmonic convergence for you. And I just remember it was a time of revelation, and also the 1960s was for me because I was a Haight-Ashbury hippie back in those days. And so it's going to be that kind of energy. And boy, do we need it. I don't know about you, but I can't stand the way things are stuck.
Yeah.
I can't stand it.
And one of the and having lived through the 60s, I'm living in my 7th decade now, although I appear younger. One of the things that I remember as I detail the biographical nature of what happened, which was tumultuous for me, was the extraordinary effortlessness of spirit, bringing the extraordinary shifts that took place, which allowed the fervor, the passion, and the ecstasy of what was taking place to land really deeply within my soma, within my body, so that I was actually able to make the shifts that I needed to make. And I remember in 1987 when I announced to my long-term partner what had happened when I'd seen these 12 angels and gone through the divine transmission, that I realized by the reaction that I received that divorce was on the cards. And it took me a year to move through that process because love for us is deep and multi-textured. But it was obvious that I was facing somebody that was not in vibrational match with the wonder and the ecstasy of the enormity of what I was seeing. And so as we go through the long dark night of the soul, and wherever anybody may be in terms of our uneasiness with what we see happening in the world, with what we feel as empaths, I do believe that this is the beginning of the revolution of the empaths, and that we are going to be carrying forward the most extraordinary nature of our superpower, which is our deep sensitivity. And you wrote this wonderful sentence, which I thought was absolutely superb, if I may use it. Bearing in mind all that we've just discussed, that we've been through, we all know, you've given us a beautiful synopsis there. You wrote, however, at the same time, we are being flooded with advanced spiritual knowledge that is moving us into unity with the divine mind. The good news is the current astrological cycles suggest we will make it. So that gives us an extraordinary boon of hope to lift us, even though we may be feeling tragic and stuck and held, and many people say blocked. I would like to see that we're just held in a holding pattern, as you were denoting with the substance of shadow, with the substance of Saturn, which of course, as we know, is a great holder, the karmic reaper that presents to us all sorts of extraordinary information that we need to really find a way of working through so that we can move into the greater incandescence of realizing how to embody the fact that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And it's not just an intellectual idea, it's a total experience. This is what I find so remarkable about your work. You bring it to us in a very articulated fashion so that we see the clarity in making it substantial for ourselves, that it really is to do with bringing the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual energies of our beings together into a wonderful harmony. And the fact that there you are talking about how the symphonic variation of the planets is going to move us into such a wonderful chorus of unified harmony that
Well, see, that's why I decided to track it.
yeah.
In the trilogy, of course, I tracked different things going along. But once I could see what was going to happen from now until through 2027, then I decided that I had to do everything I could to describe it. And the only way I can do that, I may write a book about this, but at least on my website, I've got that right now, and I could just start. And that's why I haven't been using my website at all for the last 4 or 5 years. Just busy doing other things. But the planets, when people understand the archetypal nature of a given planet, and when they can identify the part of themselves that matches up with that archetype, then they can really start to develop. And fortunately, with astrology is extremely complex. But you can write about astrology in a way that describes these things that almost anyone can understand. And that's really what I was specialized in. And what started that was I went to graduate school in Chicago at Loyola in Matthew Fox's program, which is a wonderful program. And once he found out that I was an astrologer and a good one, he had me teach in his program while I was there for the year. And since 90% of the students were priests and nuns, it was quite a challenge. And so I spent the year teaching them how astrology works and reading for them. And they got to the point by the end of that where they understood what I was talking about. And so once I found a way to do it, I do it quite easily. And so people need to understand these archetypes. They don't need to understand astrology, but they really need to understand something like the Plutonic force in themselves and the depth and the power of Pluto. I mean, Pluto literally takes you right to the iron core crystal in the center of our planet and sets you up in relationship to all. And of course, I work with 9 to 11 dimensions. And Pluto, you just tune into Pluto and you're tuning into all of that rich dimensional matrix. And Stewart, I'd like to say something about that. I think each one of my characters is probably an archetype, or at least they're speaking through an archetypal field that we can resonate. And the reason that I loved writing this trilogy, and the reason I've just reread Ruby Crystal for the fifth time for this show with you. And so I don't read most books 5 times, especially my fiction books. I've only read them once after I got them done. Yeah. But what happens with these characters is they are actually like a little symphony, working it out. And what that enabled me to do as a writer is bring out angles in their psyches that I could never bring out by just writing nonfiction. No way.
Fascinating. And I'd love to just magnify even further the power of archetypal consciousness that is really leaking into our physical membrane at this time, so that we can understand in the way that you're speaking of it. There are very few people, ladies and gentlemen, as you review this conversation, there are very few people on our planet that have the clarity of events astrology in the way that Barbara has. I've had a number of major astrologers as clients over the years, and many of them I've tried to seduce into becoming more involved in events astrology, because they often have a prescience or an intuition from their experience of not just working the science of astrology, but also of developing a conversation with individuals about their own personal astrological nature. And yet few have actually taken the baton and run with it, Yet you have. And so I'd love you to speak a little bit more about your perception of how I perceive the archetypes as keys into the very core of our consciousness. So perhaps you could reveal what your perception is of the importance and significance of archetypal wisdom at this time.
Well, I'm just, first of all, a typical Jungian. I almost became a Jungian analyst. And fortunately for all of us, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, really understood archetypal consciousness. And so by studying Jung, for anybody who really wants to understand archetypal consciousness, you've got to do a little bit of work on Jung. And then that's a little different than archetypal consciousness as an astrologer. You know? And I have found by combining what Jung understood, and Jung ended up in his later years really working with astrology and really believed in it as he got older. He wasn't like me. I was an astrologer and he was not an astrologer. But he would be totally in tune with everything I'm saying right now. And so where I really grabbed hold of the question that you're asking is by means of the painter in Ruby Crystal, Armando Pierleoni. And Armando Pierleoni is a character. This is all fiction, of course. And he comes from a very, his family basically are royalty in Italy. And his father is a count. He will become a count eventually. And his family has deep esoteric knowledge coming from Siena. And Siena is one of my favorite places on the planet in Italy. So I set the novel in Italy, the trilogy in Italy. Some of it takes place in the United States, but I set it in Italy because I have found the most profound location for archetypal feelings and consciousness is in Italy. And of course, in the book, one of the characters explains what that's all about. But Armando, when we were introduced to him in the first book as a painter, coming from the Pierleoni Siena family from Siena, Armando is a really bad guy. And the really fun thing about Armando is my daughter, Liz CLOW, is the illustrator for this trilogy. And so I've had the joy of working on a fictional trilogy with my daughter. And so she's had a lot to say as I've gone along. So she's a Scorpio, has a whole lot of planets in Scorpio. And she said, "Mom, you're just such a nice person. You're a good wife and you're a good mom, and you just live a really simple, plain kind of life." And so she said, you just aren't bad. And she said, "You have got to make him really bad." And fortunately, it worked. I listened to her. And so in the first novel, be ready for Armando, because Armando is really bad. And I'm not going to say anything more about him, except that he was the perfect vehicle for understanding Pluto. Because Armando is a painter, he was going in deep with his own work. And then lo and behold, when I got to the middle of writing Revelations of the Ruby Crystal, back in whatever it was, 2014, maybe something like that, I ran into a brick wall. Armando was bad and getting worse, and I couldn't figure out what to do with him. So I went and sat in my study with my crystal. I always get my crystal out, sat down, and I said, "Okay, Pleiadians, yeah, those are my guides. What do I do?" And this was the most amazing experience, Stewart, with this trilogy. Lorenzo Giannini appeared in my office. Unlike the other characters, he didn't appear when I started the whole thing. And in his case, he literally was physical. I could see what he looked like as much as I could see what you looked like. And he said, "I'm here to tell you that Armando has been in analysis with me for the last 10 years. I am a Jungian analyst in Rome, and he has been in therapy with me. So if you want to get anywhere with Armando Pierleoni, you got to put me in as a character." So there came Lorenzo Giannini, who ended up being one of the most profound and wonderful characters in this trilogy. He's a really, really incredible character. And he got to the bottom of why Armando was so bad. And so what happens through this trilogy is Armando is redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
Armando goes through a healing, deep healing, through a great deal of pain, and finally manages to find a woman he loves. And he ends up being an absolutely wonderful high consciousness individual. So I had the joy of taking a really bad person and moving him through, which is something I believe anyone can do. I think even somebody like Bill Gates could do it. And he's probably going to be forced to do it because there's a whole lot of people who are at the level, financial level, who are going to be forced to redeem themselves because, you know, a lot of bad stuff is going on and it's affecting our world.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that. I'll pass it back to you.
Well, that's beautiful. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that revelation. And I do want to go just a little bit more precisely into the archetypal natures, or the how we can actually just simply see templates that are very significant from a Jungian point of view, just as a, just as a sketch rather than going into a deep thesis. But of course, as you mentioned this point, there's a huge parallel with what you were mentioning, sharing with us earlier on about your revelation of what you perceived and what you've received as well from the many thought structures and thought dynamics that are being projected in your direction about the cabal, or about the group of people that are small in number and yet are some of the major controllers in the world. And one of the things that I've always been aware of, through the time of JFK's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King, of course, Malcolm X, John Lennon, and if I may leap forward into Diana's passing, which I write about very fully in the book, that obviously this was a structured form of murder. And yet, within the consciousness that we speak of, within the dark consciousness, there is an unremembered process of not seeing the might and the beauty and the wonder of human spirit, and how the human spirit always prevails. And if we allow, we are automatically enraptured by the divine, and we move into salvation, we move into redemption. For example, that 5.9 billion people wept at Diana's death. So although she may have been exterminated, the point is that she also awakened this vast wave of Shakti consciousness that hit us all in the hearts. And people are still feeling the spirit of Diana working with us. I feel her very much to be here at this time. And later, I'd love to share with you a project that I'm creating as a result of publishing this book and arousing the interest of people in understanding more about the spirit of Diana and what gift she was for us. So there is this movement towards redemption. However, back to the archetypes. So do you explore each of the 12 archetypes from a Jungian perspective, or do you cluster each of the personalities in the trilogy?
Well, the way I deal with archetypes in my own esoteric system is coming from the Pleiadian Agenda and Alchemy of Nine Dimensions.
Right.
And so in my system, the archetypes are in the fourth dimension. And my system's completely different than what physicists say about dimensionality. It fits with string theory. And the archetypes exist in the fourth dimension because the third dimension is our solid world in space and time. But then what happens is when we are alive and in bodies in the third dimension, then what happens is our individual personal minds connect with the thoughts and feelings of all of the people on the planet. So that's definition of being an incarnated human being. You're born in this dimension, but then what happens is you're plugged into this fourth dimensional field. And this fourth dimensional field, first of all, there's positive things about it. It connects all of us, but there's also a tendency for the herd mentality to get going and for archetypes to become distorted, and potential ways of doing things to become very, very distorted. And so, as far as the archetypes are concerned, I can feel each one of the dimensions. And some of my students tell me they can too. I don't know, but I can feel the vibratory difference between the third dimension and the fourth dimension. And so all I have to do if I want to contact an archetypal realm is to move right into the frequency of the fourth dimension. And this is not an easy thing to do these days because the fourth dimensional field is very dark right now. Because of the collective thoughts of the humans on the planet and the struggle between the East and the West, the fourth dimensional field is very hard to navigate. But because of the work that I do and because I think it's important, I spend a lot of time traveling around in the fourth dimension, and I don't know what else to say.
And would you agree that the fourth dimension is also a huge transition point between the consciousness of three dimension and moving into fifth dimensionality? I mean, for example, I've spent a lot of time physically and metaphysically in fourth dimension helping people who are held within the membrane of, who have died, who have passed, but in often very traumatic situations, and that they're held within the membrane of the fourth dimension and are often clustered by very dark entity. And that part of our journey, I feel, is as light workers, is to shine the light so deeply into that space. It's rather like an echo of what you were saying earlier. I see who you are. I see you, as opposed to responding or reacting through fear or through trauma or through, oh my God, it's scary. We need to grow up and move away from that field so that we can actually hold the light as strongly as possible, knowing that when we do this, we are clustered, we are held by a communion of angelic beings. And of course, the ascended masters and mistresses automatically come with those archetypal beings that we see emerging through the mythos or the sacred hierarchy of the varying civilizations that have existed before our own. One of them being Atlantis, another being obviously earlier, and the great livelihood of Egypt, which is a culture that I visited as a pilgrim for 50 years and have run retreats in for the last 22 years. That these beings step forward. But archetypes, when you've spoken of the darker archetype of this artist, how would you define him as being? If you gave him a name as an archetype, he would be a summation of darkness, or would you give it another name?
Well, see, that's so. In order to deal with this dark night of the soul that I've been immersed in, I found the only theology that helped me at all was Gnostic theology. And so I went into a deep encounter with Gnosticism. And as you know, it goes all the way through the trilogy. One of the main characters, Sarah Appel, is a scholar and also connects Gnosticism with early Christian issues. It goes all the way through. It's kind of wonderful material. But in my case, what I'm after and what I'm looking for is what the Gnostics said about the archons, because the archons are a force. No, in fact, it's a theological issue that was deeply discussed from 500 BC to the time of Christ. And also, there was a very, very deep knowledge about the archons and the negative forces in the universe for at least 10,000 years before that. What happened with Christianity and the burning of the Alexandrian library. The Alexandrian library was just a huge Gnostic library and also was just filled with data from other ancient sacred cultures. And Christianity basically tried to destroy that. They haven't succeeded, but they tried to destroy that. And what the Gnostics were saying, to put it simply, that we have to understand these forces and we have to confront them, and we have to live our lives in ways that don't allow these kinds of forces to control our reality. And there have been periods on this planet when people have lived that way. I time travel back into the past a lot. I've time traveled back 100,000 years or so in human cultures. And there have been periods like during the megalithic age when people were really working with how to fuse the stars with the planet. They didn't have as much of a problem as we're having with these archontic forces right now. And the reason we're having such a problem is the suppression by Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, of the truth. The truth of what's making life hard for us has been taken from the culture. And once you understand what the truth is, then you can do something about it. Otherwise, you're helpless. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, what comes to the forefront of my consciousness as you say this is the techniques, the tools that you have developed over the years to be able to not just discern, but also to penetrate into understanding the truth, knowing the truth. What are the awarenesses and tools that you have?
Yeah. And, you know, I don't want to talk politics and I don't support one side or the other, but Trump was right about the deep state. And the deep state has functioned as an archontic force since the end of World War II. And a lot of people, for instance, JFK, a lot of people have been murdered because of the deep state, including my own uncle, my father's sister's husband, back after World War II. It hit us right in our own family. And when I was a young child, I was aware of the deep state and what it was doing to our country. So the point is here, and this is where Trump has been a positive force, he has caused a lot of discussion about a lot of topics that were completely suppressed. That's been a very, very positive thing. And it's going to come up in the next election again.
Yeah.
Next election, I'm sure, is going to be very disturbing for people.
Yes.
This is going to be, in fact, I'll just say this, when people do deal with the issues around this upcoming election, every time you get really upset and all that, use it as your own opportunity to go deeply into what you really know.
Yeah.
You know?
So this is what I wanted to rest on, because as people listen in, we're speaking of these very broad macro gestures in a very specific way of the tools that we can develop for ourselves to penetrate into what we're seeing as the clustering darkness. And it seems that the tools, as you've just mentioned, is what is your truth, what is our truth, what is specifically held within the individual. And it seems that what we need to do is to detach, feel stillness all the way through our beings, and then observe without moving into the reactive force of defense, revenge, or fear, of just simply feeling the stillness, knowing that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and moving consistently into the infinitesimal embrace of what the divine offers us, because the divine is always there, waiting at the door, at the gateway, at the doors of heaven, whatever, to welcome us into a space of sublime peace and stillness and tranquility and all oneness. So as we perceive the rocky nature of what we're going to be going through, or the rocking nature of what we're going to be going through over the next 6 months to a year, we can see the age of transparency will bring us elucidated information about the people that have been creating levels of corruption, both immediately in our own social context and over there, so to speak, in other countries, other nations, and in other central organizing principles, other governments. It's interesting that Marianne Williamson is stepping forward to run for presidential election in 2024.
I know, and I hope the media is going to give her some voice. First of all, she's an absolutely brilliant person. I mean, of all of the candidates who could come forth, she will be the most verbal and the most intelligent one of all, but also heart.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, sometimes to just make this a little bit more simple, when you contemplate dark things and you start to realize that you're in the archetypal realm and that you are getting in touch with both sides. The archetypal realm is always positive and negative, dark and light. It's a spectrum. And so the more, when you go into the fourth dimension, the more you can widen that spectrum. And you could say, like on one end of the war in the Ukraine, come on, I'm not really quite dumb enough to believe a lot of the stuff that's being said about Putin in the Western media. Or you can go to the other side of it and you can say, like, come on, we're not getting the real truth about what actually, you've got to widen that spectrum out and get more information. And then what's really important is as you widen that spectrum out, then move into your heart. Because what the etheric realm and the energetic field that we all live in is really needing is the power of the heart. And we're really lucky to be alive right now because some researchers have proven that the heart is a thinking organ and a powerful organ, just like our brains. And we spend too much time in our heads and not enough time in our hearts. And so that transition from the head and widening the spectrum, if it goes into the heart, then what's happening is you're moving into the fifth dimension. And once you get into the fifth dimension and hold it, when I move into that, then I hold that energy in my heart and meditate with it, because what you're doing is you're freeing and opening the hearts of millions and millions of people. And we really need this right now. I'd say we need that. And the other thing that we need is we need to start dealing with death intelligently again. We've had a couple of generations now of absolutely incorrect teachings about what death really is, which is the return to our ensoulment. And when we think about death, and we've all been dealing with a lot of death, haven't we, lately? It's so important to bring in that light and bring that energy from the fifth dimension to the person who has passed. Because normally, when things are normal, they're not normal right now. We're really trapped in a very negative field right now. When things are more normal, when you die, you immediately go right out to this incredible field of beautiful blue light. That's where you go. It's not a trauma for the person who passes. But the culture is bringing in this idea that death is so, you've got to fight death. Let's have a big battle. We're having a battle with the only thing that we all do, no matter what.
And for the reasons, of course, that we know in our compassion that are associated with loss. But again, if we can live in our hearts as we go through the trauma of the deep feeling, if we can simply find greater stillness and live within our hearts, detach from whatever's taking place and recognize that this is a soul quest, we're automatically elevated into a very different kingdom. And the heart is ready, I believe. All of my work is about stimulating the heart, particularly through the fact that we each have a note, we each have a signature sound, which is right at the very core of our psychic and physical blueprint. It is our signature note, and it is emitted through the heart. As Rumi says, if words arise from the heart, they enter the heart. If words arise from the tongue alone, they don't pass beyond the ears. But if we come into our hearts, we automatically find this extraordinary access point, which is a gateway into heaven, as you're saying, a gateway into the fifth dimension. And so, if we can really tune into that, I believe that we're moving into another level of consciousness, which is an evocation of the fifth dimension, which I'm calling the metaphoric consciousness, that I believe, if I may say, that many of your characters sprang from. Because when we go back into the Renaissance, whether it be the French or indeed the golden age of the Elizabethan Renaissance or into the Italian Renaissance, we see that the metaphoric consciousness was alive because these people were living before the age of the noise, whether it be the noise of the machines or the noise of this, which is not, been formulated into simply being a machine, where people are just simply thinking in terms of quantification rather than in terms of the qualitative nature of their lives. And that if we can really move into the metaphoric consciousness and use the great, use the wonder of your trilogy, as well as using the great writers of the 19th century, who also were living, although industrialization, as we know, had been given birth to, that they were also living before the noise
Yeah, I
of
know.
machines.
And that's the challenge to me as a fiction writer, because if people don't read it, it's not going to do what it needs to do.
Yeah.
And this trilogy, the books in this trilogy, are highly spiritually transformative. But
Yes.
so many people just think that fiction is nonsense. And of course, fiction has been degraded by the quality of modern fiction. But classic fiction is a great spiritual medium, just like painters are a spiritual medium, and great music. All these things are extremely important to us at this point. I think maybe what may happen, Stewart, is as these planetary transits start to shift the quality of the field, people might just automatically start to gravitate toward true art and true music and true visual stimulation.
And let us not forget dramatic literature.
Mhm.
And some of the writing that I'm seeing emerging at the moment, albeit through the context of the televisual, is really extraordinary, and particularly when it's an evocation of the history of our peoples, and particularly the history of your great nation, the way that the pioneers founded post the coming together of the great patriarchs, how I'm referring, of course, to the writing of the Constitution. How then suddenly your great nation became peopled by the emigres, and the lives that they lived, the stories that are being told, are moral landscapes that are rich in initiation, in life and death, rich in the substance of redemption, and as we've been saying, the evocation of the great archetypes, the great hero against the terrible anti-hero, the dark one against the light bringer. These classical concepts, because as we know, the classics provide us with an understanding of the durability of our peoples. So the more we can tune into the great works of art, whether it be, your wonderful books, the other books of literature. I mean, the wonderment of Anthony Trollope that you mentioned earlier is that he was a great social diarist. So he was actually writing a document of the times. And if we touch back into that, we see that it wasn't just simply an arrangement of gossip. It was actually about the fundamental nature of the way that those people lived their lives and the choices that they made.
That's right. And then the best thing about fiction, speaking of Trollope, is that if you read histories of the Parliament in England in the 19th century or whatever English social history, you don't remember anything. Fiction allows you to remember. And that's why people read novels about the royals and stuff written by different writers. And so we've kind of lost our ability to tune into another time because we've only been doing it, most people, by means of nonfiction. You don't remember anything except if you have to take a test for it in college. But if you read a great story of the past in a novel, it stays with you because the characters stay with you.
Yes. And so we're speaking about that immense force within our peoples around the world, whatever culture we represent, whatever language we're speaking, that wonderful force of the oral tradition of our peoples. This has been the telling of a great story, this conversation. And I want to thank you deeply for the wonderment of what you've shared with us. And I'm sure all of those people in cyberspace are agreeing with me. This has been a great story. And I would like to say, can we all please reverberate a vast heartfelt plea, vibration of love to Barbara, so that she could move on to her next novella, extension of the work, because we can hear that she's bubbling away, she's cooking inside, and is going to produce another great work of art, which will be an extension of the consciousness of this fundamental trilogy. So please, ladies and gentlemen, acquire the trilogy. And if you don't buy all 3 books, start with the first one. You'll be so enticed that you'll have to buy the second. And we need to know exactly how to get hold of you through your website. So I know Ryan will bring up onto, there we are, you see. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to go to CLOW 2012, which was the year of the precession of the equinoxes.com. And there will be Barbara in all of her glory, bringing us to the wonderful wonderment of all of these richnesses that you've shared with us. As a parting thought, is there anything that you'd like to shine into this latter part of our conversation, because we're getting to the end of our hour together?
Well, I'd just like to say that on the website, I'm going to be tracking this unfoldment in the cosmic realm from now through 2027. And it's all free. You just, you're going to, I'm having my techie guy put a button on it so you can press a button and then it'll just come to you. But I'm going to do my level best to describe what the cosmos is asking of us now. And it's asking a lot.
Is asking a great deal. We will be able to expand into that macro vision, will we not?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm an optimist all the way. I've never varied on that.
So, because it's very easy through these churning times to feel very micro in the face of the macro.
Yes.
Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up at every turn, never to leave us till we take the longest stride of soul we humans ever took, which is an extraction or an excerpt from a poem written by Christopher Fry, who wrote it in the 1930s when he saw the rise of fascism, and the intelligentsia of Europe were looking not in awe, but in great trepidation at what was taking place. So we realize that these tests that are coming to us are really strong, muscular, spiritual, attitudinal tests to move us into the wonder and the joy and the great beauty of what we truly are when the light shines strongly within. Barbara, this has been the most amazing conversation. I hope you will return in our next season of Global Female Soul Stewards. It would be wonderful to have you back and to hear, it'll be in 6 months' time or whatever, to hear where you've got to in the next revelation of this great story.
Well, I'll take you up on that.
Oh, thank you. So thank you so much for being with us. This has been such a joy and a treat. And wow, have we got many thoughts to think on now from what you've shared. And to all of you who are tuning in or have tuned in, please keep watching. And don't forget that on March the 12th will be a workshop of enchantment, which you are most welcome to come to, where we will celebrate the conviction of this extraordinary lunar cycle that we're going through this week. And there'll be lots of information, as you heard, from an events astrology point of view. Not that I'm an astrologer, I'm just simply a willing student. And so thanks for listening. And Barbara, please stay where you are while we close down. And thank you, Ryan.